To understand what Mussolini did to Italian women, we need to go back to October 1922. Benito Mussolini, a former socialist turned fascist firebrand, has just marched on Rome with thousands of Blackshirt paramilitary supporters. King Victor Emmanuel III, terrified of civil war, invites Mussolini to form a government. At 39 years old, Mussolini becomes the youngest prime minister in Italian history. He stands on the balcony of Palazzo Venezia in Rome, looking out over the cheering crowds. He's a compact man with a prominent jaw, burning eyes, and a theatrical speaking style that electrifies audiences. But behind the charisma lies a very specific vision for Italy, one that will fundamentally reshape the role of women in Italian society. Mussolini believes Italy is weak. The birth rate is declining. Italian men, in his view, have become soft, corrupted by liberal democracy and socialism. Women have started working outside the home, pursuing education, even demanding political rights. In 1919, feminists organized massive demonstrations in Rome calling for suffrage. Some women are using birth control. Urban birth rates are dropping. To Mussolini, this is a catastrophe. He sits in his office in December 1922, just 2 months after taking power, meeting with his advisors. On his desk are demographic reports showing Italy's population growth slowing. He slams his fist on the table. A nation's power is measured by its population. We need soldiers. We need workers. We need bodies to build the empire. His solution is simple and brutal. Italian women must become baby-making machines for the fascist state. But Mussolini's vision goes deeper than just increasing births. He wants to fundamentally redefine Italian womanhood itself. In his ideology, women are not individuals with rights and aspirations. They are biological instruments of the state, vessels for producing the next generation of fascist warriors. Their bodies, their careers, their education, their sexuality, all of it belongs to the nation. Over the next 2 decades, Mussolini will construct one of the most comprehensive systems of state control over women in modern history. It will involve laws, propaganda, economic pressure, public shaming, and, when necessary, violence. The Italian women who lived through this era would never forget it. January 1927. Mussolini delivers what historians will later call his Ascension Day speech to the Italian parliament. He's been in power for 5 years now, consolidating his dictatorship, crushing opposition parties, and building the machinery of the fascist state. Today he's announcing his most ambitious domestic policy yet, the battle for births. Standing at the podium, his chest thrust forward, Mussolini declares, "Let us be frank with ourselves. What are 40 million Italians compared to 90 million? Germans and 200 million Slavs. Let us turn to the West. What are 40 million Italians compared to 40 million Frenchmen plus 90 million inhabitants of their colonies, or compared to 46 million Englishmen plus 450 million who live in their colonies?" His voice rises. "Gentlemen, Italy, if she is to count for something, must appear on the threshold of the second half of this century with a population of at least 60 million inhabitants." The math is simple but staggering. Italy has about 40 million people in 1927. Mussolini wants 60 million by 1950. That requires millions of additional births. That requires Italian women to fundamentally change their lives. Within weeks, the government begins rolling out the first wave of policies. First comes the tax on bachelors. Any unmarried man over 25 must pay special taxes to the state. The message is clear. Get married, make babies, serve the nation. Second comes the exclusion of women from most government jobs. In March 1927, Mussolini's government issues a decree limiting women's access to civil service positions. The reasoning, stated explicitly in government documents, is that women should not compete with men for jobs. They should be at home raising children. Third comes the propaganda campaign. The Fascist Party launches a massive public relations effort to glorify motherhood and demonize childless women. Posters appear across Italy showing heroic Italian mothers surrounded by many children, with slogans like "The mother is the heart of the home" and "The future of Italy lives in Italian wombs." But these are just the opening moves. Mussolini is building towards something much more comprehensive. In his private office, he's meeting with demographers and statisticians. He wants data. How many children are Italian women having? Why is the rate declining? What can be done to reverse it? The answer his experts give him is disturbing. Urban, educated women are having fewer children. Women in cities like Milan and Turin are using birth control, delaying marriage, prioritizing careers. The birth rate in northern Italian cities has dropped to around 2.5 children per woman. Not enough to sustain population growth. Mussolini's response is swift and authoritarian. Then we will force them to have more children. We will make it economically impossible to remain childless. We will make it shameful. What follows is a cascade of increasingly draconian measures that will reach into the most intimate aspects of women's lives. December 1930. The Fascist Grand Council meets in Rome to formalize what will become the centerpiece of Mussolini's demographic campaign: the criminalization of birth control and abortion. Italy had relatively liberal laws on birth control before fascism. Contraceptives were available in pharmacies. Women could access information about family planning. Abortion was illegal, but rarely prosecuted. That's about to change completely. On December 19th, 1930, Mussolini signs the Penal Code of 1930, also called the Rocco Code, after Justice Minister Alfredo Rocco. Buried in this massive legal document are Articles 553 and 554, which criminalize the sale, distribution, and advertisement of contraceptives. Pharmacists who sell birth control can face prison. Doctors who provide information about contraception can lose their licenses. But the law goes further. Article 546 increases penalties for abortion. Women who seek abortions face prison sentences of up to 5 years. Doctors who perform abortions face even longer sentences, up to 12 years. And crucially, the law defines abortion in the broadest possible terms, including any procedure that might prevent a fertilized egg from implanting. The fascist regime frames this as protecting Italian babies. The reality is, it's about controlling women's bodies. Consider what this means in practical terms. A married woman in Rome who already has 4 children and can barely afford to feed them cannot legally prevent another pregnancy. A young woman in Milan who becomes pregnant out of wedlock has no legal option to end the pregnancy, even in the earlier stages. A doctor who tries to help either woman faces professional destruction and imprisonment. The enforcement is aggressive and often brutal. Fascist police begin raiding pharmacies looking for contraceptives. Women suspected of seeking abortions are interrogated. In some cases, Women who've had miscarriages are investigated to determine if they somehow induced them. Giovanna Rossi, a 28-year-old factory worker from Turin, becomes pregnant in 1932 with her fifth child. She and her husband are already struggling to feed their family. In desperation, she seeks out a back-alley abortion. Someone reports her to the authorities, possibly a neighbor, possibly the person who performed the procedure. The police arrest Giovanna. She's interrogated for hours, pressured to reveal who helped her. Eventually, she's convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Her children are left with her husband, who cannot care for them alone. 2 are sent to live with relatives. The youngest is placed in a state institution. This is not an isolated case. Between 1930 and 1943, thousands of Italian women are prosecuted under the anti-abortion laws. Thousands more are investigated, humiliated and traumatized even when not convicted. But Mussolini isn't done. In 1933, he introduces even more aggressive measures. January 1933. Antonio Ferrara sits in his small apartment in Naples, staring at a government notice. He's 29 years old, works as a clerk in a shipping office, and has just been informed he owes a substantial tax payment because he's unmarried. The notice is coldly bureaucratic. As per the decree law of December 19th, 1926, and subsequent amendments, all unmarried men between ages 25 and 65 are subject to taxation to support state demographic policies. Antonio does the math. The tax is significant, roughly equivalent to a month's salary. For a working-class man like him, it's financially crushing. This is Mussolini's bachelor tax in action. The policy has 2 goals: punish men who aren't contributing to population growth, and pressure them into marriage. And it works at least partially. Marriage rates do increase in the early 1930s, driven partly by economic pressure. But the policy has an unintended consequence. It creates a market for marriages of convenience. Some men marry to avoid the tax, but have no intention of having children. Some marry women they barely know, leading to unstable and often abusive relationships. For women, the bachelor tax creates its own pressures. Young women are increasingly seen as commodities in a demographic market. Families push daughters to marry early, sometimes to men much older, because unmarried women are viewed as economic burdens. Rosa Mariani is 22 when her father arranges her marriage to a 41-year-old businessman from Bologna. She barely knows the man, but her father is under financial pressure, and the businessman is wealthy. Rosa has no say in the matter. Under fascist law and social pressure, a woman's primary value is as a wife and mother. Her individual desires are irrelevant. The wedding takes place in April 1934. Rosa stands at the altar wearing a white dress, her hands shaking. She looks at her husband-to-be and feels nothing but dread. But in fascist Italy, a woman's feelings about her marriage are unimportant. What matters is that she fulfills her demographic duty. Within a year, Rosa is pregnant. Within 5 years, she has 3 children. She never escapes the marriage. She becomes exactly what Mussolini designed her to be: a mother serving the state. May 1938. Claudia Benedetti walks out of her office at a textile company in Milan for the last time. She's 34 years old, unmarried, and until today, a successful accountant. She's just been fired. The reason? She's a woman. In 1938, Mussolini's government intensifies its campaign to remove women from the workforce. The policy is called Operazione Lavoro, Operation Work, and it's framed as protecting male employment during economic downturns. But the real goal is to push women back into the home, where they can focus on producing children. The government issues new regulations limiting women to no more than 10% of employees in most private companies. Banks, insurance companies, and industrial firms begin systematically firing female workers. Women who remain in the workforce often face pay cuts. Officially, women are paid 50% less than men for the same work. The fascist regime's logic is openly stated in government publications. Women's true career is motherhood. Work outside the home distracts from this sacred duty and undermines the Italian family. For women like Claudia, this is devastating. She's spent years building her career, developing professional skills, establishing financial independence. All of it is erased by government decree. She goes home to her apartment and sits in silence. She has no husband to support her, no family wealth to fall back on. The government has effectively made her unemployable in her chosen field. Over the next year, Claudia searches for work. She finds occasional secretarial jobs, but nothing with the responsibility or pay of her previous position. Eventually, she's forced to move in with her brother's family, becoming dependent on his income. This pattern repeats across Italy. Thousands of professional women are pushed out of careers and into economic dependency. The message is clear. A woman's place is in the home, raising children for the fascist state. But even women who stay home aren't safe from Mussolini's policies. Because the fascist regime isn't just interested in where women work, it's interested in their bodies, their fertility, and their complete submission to demographic goals. July 1925. Even before the most aggressive laws, Mussolini establishes the Opera Nazionale Maternità e Infanzia, the National Agency for Maternity and Childhood. On paper, ONMI exists to support mothers and children through healthcare, financial assistance, and education. In reality, it becomes a massive surveillance apparatus that monitors women's reproductive lives and enforces fascist demographic policies. ONMI establishes offices in every Italian province. Social workers, nurses, and officials fan out across Italy, visiting homes, tracking pregnancies, monitoring births, and identifying women who aren't fulfilling their demographic duties. Elena Moretti is 31, married, with one child. She lives in a small town outside Verona. In October 1934, she receives a visit from an ONMI official, a stern woman in her 50s carrying a leather-bound notebook. The official sits at Elena's kitchen table and begins asking questions. How many children do you have? When was your last child born? Are you planning to have more children? Have you consulted a doctor about family planning? Elena answers carefully, aware that anything she says could be reported to authorities. Yes, she'd like more children. No, she's not using birth control. Yes, she understands her duty to the state. The official makes notes in her book. Before leaving, she says, "The Duce expects Italian women to have at least 4 children. You have only 1. You are failing in your duty to the nation." Elena watches the woman leave, feeling a mixture of anger, humiliation, and fear. The fascist state has literally sent an agent into her home to interrogate her about her reproductive choices. This is the reality for millions of Italian women. ONMI officials track pregnancies, monitor births, and create detailed records of women's reproductive histories. Women who have few or no children are identified and sometimes publicly shamed. In some communities, local fascist officials compile lists of demographic shirkers, women who aren't having enough children. The surveillance extends into healthcare. Doctors are required to report pregnancies to ONMI. Midwives must register all births. Women who seek medical care related to reproductive health are documented in state databases. But ONMI also offers rewards for women who comply with demographic goals. This is the carrot to accompany the stick. December 24th, 1933. Rome's Teatro dell'Opera is packed with women and their families. They're here for a special ceremony, the awarding of medals to Italy's most prolific mothers. Mussolini himself presides over the event, standing on the stage in his military uniform, chest covered with medals. Behind him hangs a massive fascist symbol, the fasces, a bundle of rods with an axe, representing strength through unity and authority. One by one, women are called to the stage. These are the women who fulfilled Mussolini's demographic vision. Mothers of 7, 8, 10, even 12 children. They walk forward, some young, some elderly, all wearing their best clothes for this moment of state recognition. Mussolini personally pins medals on each woman. The medals are silver, bearing the inscription Medaglia della Maternità, Medal of Motherhood. For women with 7 to 9 children, a silver medal. For women with 10 or more, gold. The audience applauds. Fascist propaganda cameras record the scene for newsreels that will play in cinemas across Italy. The message is clear. These women are heroes of the fascist state. These women have done their duty. But there's another message too. If you're not like these women, you're failing Italy. The medal system is part of a broader program of incentives and rewards. The government provides financial bonuses for large families, marriage loans that are partially forgiven with each child born, family allowances, tax breaks. ONMI distributes baby clothes, food vouchers, and healthcare for mothers with many children. For poor families, these incentives matter. In rural areas where poverty is endemic, the financial support from having more children can make a real difference in survival. But the incentives also create perverse pressures. Women feel obligated to keep having children even when they're exhausted, unhealthy, or unable to care for existing children. Some women have pregnancies year after year, their bodies breaking down under the strain. Maria Lombardi has her 10th child in 1938 at age 41. She's malnourished, exhausted, and suffering from complications related to her previous pregnancies. Her doctor advises her not to have more children. The risk to her health is severe. But Maria feels pressure from her husband, her community, and the state itself. Having many children is her duty, her identity, her only source of social value in fascist Italy. She becomes pregnant again in 1939. She dies in childbirth in 1940, leaving 11 children motherless. This is the dark reality behind the medals and propaganda. Mussolini's demographic campaign doesn't just incentivize childbirth, it coerces it, glorifies it, and sometimes kills the women who comply with it. Throughout the 1930s, the fascist regime deploys a massive propaganda apparatus to reshape Italian culture's understanding of womanhood. The fascist party controls all media: newspapers, radio, cinema, publishing. There is no independent press in Italy after 1925. Everything published, broadcast, or screened must align with fascist ideology. And a central component of that ideology is the role of women. Turn on the radio in 1936, and you'll hear programs like The Hour of the Italian Woman, which features discussions of domestic skills, childcare, and women's duties to the state. Pick up a magazine and you'll see articles with titles like The Modern Woman is a Mother and Feminism is the Enemy of Italy. Go to the cinema and you'll watch newsreels showing Mussolini awarding medals to prolific mothers, fascist families marching in parades, and propaganda films depicting idealized Italian women devoted to home and family. The fascist women's organization, the Fasci Femminili, organizes massive rallies and events. At these gatherings, fascist officials give speeches extolling motherhood and attacking any deviation from traditional gender roles. Regina Teruzzi, vice president of the Fasci Femminili, declares in a 1934 speech, "The Italian woman finds her greatest fulfillment not in public life or professional ambition, but in the sacred role of motherhood. The woman who rejects this role rejects Italy itself." Young girls are indoctrinated from childhood. Schools teach that a girl's destiny is to become a wife and mother. Textbooks contain lessons on domestic skills, childcare, and women's biological duties. Girls are discouraged from pursuing higher education. University enrollment for women drops significantly during the fascist era. The fascist youth organizations, the Piccole Italiane, Little Italians, and Giovani Italiane, Young Italians, train girls in domestic skills and fascist ideology. Activities focus on sewing, cooking, and childcare. Girls march in uniforms, attend camps, and participate in rallies celebrating fascist womanhood. Luisa Benedetti is 12 when she joins the Giovani Italiane in 1936. She attends weekly meetings where leaders teach her that her body belongs to Italy, that her future is to be a mother of many children, that her value lies in serving the nation through childbirth. At one meeting, the leader says, "Girls, remember, every Italian woman must produce at least 4 soldiers for the Duce. This is not a choice. This is your duty, your purpose, your destiny." Luisa listens and absorbs these messages. By the time she's 18, she believes them completely. She marries at 19, has her first child at 20, and goes on to have 6 children by age 30. She never questions whether this is what she truly wanted. She's been conditioned since childhood to believe this is the only acceptable path. This is the power of propaganda. It doesn't just control what people do, it controls what they think they want. But not all Italian women submit. Some resist, openly or quietly, risking consequences to maintain control over their own lives. In urban centres, particularly in the north, some women continue to use birth control, despite the criminalisation. They obtain contraceptives through black markets or from sympathetic doctors who quietly defy the law. They share information through whispered networks, passing knowledge from woman to woman. Some women delay marriage or remain unmarried entirely, accepting social stigma and economic hardship rather than surrender to fascist expectations. They work in underground economies, rely on family support, or live in poverty, anything to avoid becoming demographic instruments of the state. Some women join anti-fascist movements. Groups like the Gruppi di Difesa della Donna, women's defense groups, organize in secret, distributing leaflets, criticizing fascist policies, and supporting women who resist demographic pressure. Carla Capone is 19 in 1938 when she joins the Communist Party underground. She distributes illegal newspapers, organizes women workers, and helps women access contraception and abortion despite the risks. She's arrested in 1941, interrogated by fascist police, and imprisoned for 6 months. In prison, Carla meets other women arrested for similar crimes, refusing to conform to fascist gender expectations. They share stories of resistance, of small acts of defiance, of refusing to let the state control their bodies and futures. When Carla is released, she returns to resistance work immediately. She will go on to become a prominent partisan fighter during the Italian resistance, risking her life to fight fascism. Her resistance to Mussolini's policies on women is inseparable from her broader fight against the regime. But resistance comes at a cost. Women who defy demographic policies face social ostracism, economic punishment, legal prosecution, and sometimes violence. The fascist state and its supporters will not tolerate women who refuse to comply. September 1938. Mussolini introduces Italy's racial laws, a series of anti-Semitic policies modelled on Nazi Germany's Nuremberg laws. While primarily targeting Jews, these laws also intensify control over women, particularly Jewish women and women in Italy's colonies. The racial laws ban marriages between Italians and Jews. Jewish women are expelled from schools and universities. Jewish families are stripped of property and citizenship. But the laws also reveal the intersection of racism and misogyny in fascist ideology. Mussolini is obsessed with racial purity. He believes Italians are a superior race, despite dubious historical claims, and that racial mixing weakens the nation. Women's bodies become battlegrounds for racial policies. In Italy's African colonies, Libya, Eritrea, Somalia, and after 1936, Ethiopia, the fascist regime enacts brutal policies controlling relationships between Italian men and African women. Interracial relationships are criminalized. Children of mixed race are denied Italian citizenship. African women in Italian colonies face systematic sexual violence from Italian soldiers and administrators. Rape is widespread and rarely prosecuted. When African women become pregnant by Italian men, they're abandoned with no legal recourse. Waizaro Belinesh is an Ethiopian woman in her 20s when Italian forces occupy her village in 1936. An Italian officer rapes her. She becomes pregnant. When she approaches Italian authorities for support, she's turned away. The racial laws explicitly state that her child has no claim to Italian support or citizenship. She raises her son alone, in poverty, in a war-torn country. The child will grow up stateless, belonging to neither Ethiopia nor Italy, a victim of fascist racial and gender policies. Back in Italy, the racial laws create new pressures on Italian women. The regime's obsession with racial purity means Italian women are increasingly seen not just as mothers, but as racial guardians. They're expected to produce pure Italian children, to reject relationships with Jews or foreigners, to maintain the racial integrity of the fascist nation. This adds another layer of control. Women's sexual choices, their relationships, their partners, all become subject to state scrutiny and regulation. June 1940. Mussolini declares war, entering World War II on the side of Nazi Germany. Italy is unprepared for war, but Mussolini is convinced of quick victory. The war transforms Italian women's lives yet again. With men conscripted into the military, women are suddenly needed in the workforce. the same workforce they were pushed out of in the 1930s. The fascist regime performs an ideological flip. Suddenly, women working in factories is patriotic. Women taking on traditionally male roles is necessary for victory. The propaganda shifts. Now Italian women are shown as strong, capable workers supporting the war effort. But this shift is pragmatic, not principled. The regime still expects women to maintain their primary role as mothers. Women are expected to work exhausting shifts in factories, then go home and care for children and households without support. Francesca Ricci is 28 in 1942, working in a munitions factory in Turin while her husband fights in North Africa. She works 10-hour shifts producing artillery shells, then goes home to care for her 3 young children. There's no childcare support, no relief from domestic duties. She's simply expected to do everything. The work is dangerous. Factory accidents are common. Women are exposed to toxic chemicals, work with hazardous materials, and operate dangerous machinery with minimal training or safety equipment. And still the demographic pressure continues. Even during wartime, the fascist regime continues to glorify motherhood and pressure women to have children. The contradiction is absurd. Women are supposed to work full-time for the war effort, while also producing future soldiers for the nation. As the war turns against Italy, conditions worsen. Allied bombing devastates Italian cities. Food becomes scarce. Women wait in ration lines for hours, trying to feed their families on inadequate supplies. By 1943, Italy is collapsing. The Allies invade Sicily in July. Mussolini is overthrown by his own fascist Grand Council on July 25th, arrested, and the new government begins negotiating with the Allies. Though Mussolini is rescued by the Germans and sets up a puppet regime in northern Italy, the Italian Social Republic, his power is broken. For Italian women, the collapse of fascism brings both relief and new dangers. September 1943. After Italy's surrender to the Allies, German forces occupy northern and central Italy. Mussolini's puppet regime, the Italian Social Republic, controls the north. The country descends into civil war as resistance movements form to fight German occupiers and Italian fascists. Thousands of Italian women join the resistance, the partisan movement. These women have lived through 2 decades of fascist control, oppression, and propaganda. Now they're fighting back. Some women serve as staffette, couriers who carry messages, weapons, and supplies through German checkpoints. They hide weapons under their clothes, pretend to be ordinary civilians, and risk execution if caught. Others join combat units, taking up arms and fighting alongside male partisans. Women like Carla Caponi, Ada Gobetti, and Tina Anselmi become legendary partisan fighters. Lydia Menapace is 20 when she joins the resistance. She studied at university, one of the few women who managed to access higher education under fascism. Now she uses her skills to forge documents, organize safe houses, and coordinate partisan operations. In April 1944, Lydia is transporting a suitcase full of weapons through Milan when German soldiers stop her at a checkpoint. She knows if they open the suitcase, she'll be arrested and probably executed. She smiles at the soldier, flirts, makes small talk about the weather. The soldier waves her through without searching her bag. This happens dozens, hundreds, thousands of times across occupied Italy. Women use the fascists' own gender stereotypes against them, pretending to be harmless, weak, decorative women, while actively fighting the regime. The irony is profound. Mussolini spent 2 decades telling Italian women they were naturally weak, passive, suited only for motherhood and domestic life. Now women are proving him catastrophically wrong by fighting and dying for Italy's liberation. Over 35,000 women joined the partisan resistance. Over 4,600 are arrested, tortured, or executed by German and fascist forces. Their courage and sacrifice helped defeat the regime that oppressed them. April 28, 1945. Benito Mussolini is captured by communist partisans near Lake Como as he attempts to flee to Switzerland. The next day, April 29th, he is executed by firing squad along with his mistress, Clara Petacci, and several fascist officials. His body is taken to Milan and hung upside down from a gas station roof in Piazzale Loreto, alongside other executed fascists. Crowds gather to spit on the corpses, throw stones, and celebrate the end of fascist rule. Among those crowds are women who lived through 2 decades of Mussolini's policies, who were told their bodies belong to the state, who were forced out of careers, punished for reproductive choices, and subjected to constant propaganda and control. They look at Mussolini's corpse hanging upside down and feel something complex: relief, rage, grief for the years lost, and hope for what comes next. But Mussolini's death doesn't immediately erase his legacy. The systems he built, the attitudes he promoted, the damage he inflicted, all of it persists. Post-war Italy inherits fascist laws. The Rocco Code, including its criminalization of abortion and contraception, remains in effect. Italian women won't gain the right to vote until 1946. Divorce won't be legalized until 1970. Abortion won't be decriminalized until 1978. The fight for women's rights in Italy continues for decades after fascism's fall, because Mussolini's policies didn't just pass laws, they shaped cultural attitudes. The idea that women's primary value lies in motherhood, that women shouldn't work outside the home, that women's bodies are subject to state control. These ideas persist in Italian society long after the fascist regime collapses. Let's follow some of the women we've met to see how fascist policies shaped their lives in the long term. Maria Castellani, the school teacher we met at the beginning, never returned to teaching after being pushed out in the 1930s. She had 5 children total, raised them through war and hardship, and lived to see Italy's democratic reconstruction. She died in 1968 at age 65, just as Italy's feminist movement was beginning to challenge the patriarchal structures fascism reinforced. She never spoke much about the fascist years to her grandchildren. The trauma ran too deep. Rosa Mariani, the young woman forced into marriage to a much older man, remained married until her husband's death in 1962. She raised her children, endured a loveless marriage, and never had the opportunity to pursue the education or career she might have wanted. In the 1970s, she watched her own daughters fight for rights she never had, and she supported them quietly in ways she couldn't support herself in the 1930s. Claudia Benedetti, the accountant fired from her job in 1938, eventually found work again after the war. She remained unmarried by choice, lived independently, and became an advocate for women's economic rights. She testified to government committees in the 1950s about the impact of fascist policies on professional women. She lived to be 91, dying in 1995, having witnessed dramatic changes in Italian women's status, but always carrying the scars of the fascist years. The demographic campaign itself ultimately failed. Despite all the laws, propaganda, incentives and coercion, Italy's birth rate never reached Mussolini's targets. The population in 1950 was around 47 million, not the 60 million Mussolini demanded. Urban birth rates remained low throughout the fascist period. Educated women continued to have fewer children, despite every pressure the state could apply. Why did it fail? Because you cannot control human reproductive behavior through authoritarianism alone. Women found ways to resist, through birth control obtained illegally, through delayed marriages, through methods the state couldn't fully monitor. And because economic conditions, particularly during the war years, made large families increasingly difficult to sustain, regardless of government incentives. But the failure of the demographic campaign doesn't mean it didn't cause immense suffering. Millions of Italian women lived under these policies for 2 decades. Their career aspirations were crushed. Their reproductive autonomy was stripped away. Their identities were reduced to biological functions. Their bodies became battlegrounds for fascist ideology. The psychological impact is impossible to fully quantify. An entire generation of Italian women grew up being told their only value was as mothers. They internalized messages of inferiority, of subservience, of biological destiny. Many never fully recovered their sense of individual identity and worth. Let's follow some of the women we've met to see how fascist policies shaped their lives in the long term. Maria Castellani, the school teacher we met at the beginning, never returned to teaching after being pushed out in the 1930s. She had 5 children total, raised them through war and hardship, and lived to see Italy's democratic reconstruction. She died in 1968 at age 65, just as Italy's feminist movement was beginning to challenge the patriarchal structures fascism reinforced. She never spoke much about the fascist years to her grandchildren. The trauma ran too deep. Rosa Mariani, the young woman forced into marriage to a much older man, remained married until her husband's death in 1962. She raised her children, endured a loveless marriage, and never had the opportunity to pursue the education or career she might have wanted. In the 1970s, she watched her own daughters fight for rights she never had, and she supported them quietly in ways she couldn't support herself in the 1930s. Claudia Benedetti, the accountant fired from her job in 1938, eventually found work again after the war. She remained unmarried by choice, lived independently, and became an advocate for women's economic rights. She testified to government committees in the 1950s about the impact of fascist policies on professional women. She lived to be 91, dying in 1995, having witnessed dramatic changes in Italian women's status, but always carrying the scars of the fascist years. The demographic campaign itself ultimately failed. Despite all the laws, propaganda, incentives and coercion, Italy's birth rate never reached Mussolini's targets. The population in 1950 was around 47 million, not the 60 million Mussolini demanded. Urban birth rates remained low throughout the fascist period. Educated women continued to have fewer children, despite every pressure the state could apply. Why did it fail? Because you cannot control human reproductive behavior through authoritarianism alone. Women found ways to resist, through birth control obtained illegally, through delayed marriages, through methods the state couldn't fully monitor. And because economic conditions, particularly during the war years, made large families increasingly difficult to sustain, regardless of government incentives. But the failure of the demographic campaign doesn't mean it didn't cause immense suffering. Millions of Italian women lived under these policies for 2 decades. Their career aspirations were crushed. Their reproductive autonomy was stripped away. Their identities were reduced to biological functions. Their bodies became battlegrounds for fascist ideology. The psychological impact is impossible to fully quantify. An entire generation of Italian women grew up being told their only value was as mothers. They internalized messages of inferiority, of subservience, of biological destiny. Many never fully recovered their sense of individual identity and worth. In 2024, historians estimate that Mussolini's demographic policies directly affected the lives of approximately 20 million Italian women, roughly half of Italy's female population during the fascist era. Every woman in Italy between 1922 and 1945 lived under these policies to some degree, whether she was forced to have children she didn't want, prevented from pursuing education or career, prosecuted for reproductive choices, or simply subjected to constant propaganda defining her worth in terms of her womb. The scale of this social engineering project is staggering. Mussolini attempted to fundamentally redefine Italian womanhood, to control the most intimate aspects of millions of lives, to subordinate individual autonomy to state demographic goals. And he did all this while claiming to honor and elevate women. Fascist propaganda constantly emphasized respect for mothers, the nobility of motherhood, the sacred role of women in building the nation. But this respect was conditional on complete submission. Women were honored only insofar as they fulfilled demographic duties. Women who resisted, who remained unmarried, had few children, pursued careers, were shamed, punished, and marginalized. This is a pattern we see in many authoritarian regimes. The glorification of traditional gender roles combined with brutal enforcement. The rhetoric of protection and honor masking systems of control and oppression. There are uncomfortable parallels in other historical contexts. Nazi Germany implemented similar prenatalist policies, though Nazi policies were more explicitly racial and genocidal. Stalin's Soviet Union alternated between conservative and progressive policies on women, but always subordinated women's rights to state goals. Authoritarian regimes across history have recognized that controlling women's bodies is central to maintaining power. And these aren't just historical lessons. In the 21st century, we still see governments attempting to control women's reproductive choices through abortion restrictions, contraception bans, limitations on reproductive health care, and policies that economically penalize women for working outside the home. The specific mechanisms differ, but the underlying logic is similar. Women's bodies are not their own, but rather resources to be managed by the state in service of demographic, economic, or ideological goals. The Italian women who resisted fascism understood something profound. Control over your own body is inseparable from freedom itself. When the state dictates your reproductive choices, controls your access to education and work, and defines your value solely in terms of biological function, you are not free, no matter how much propaganda glorifies your sacred role. In the decades after World War II, Italian historians conducted thousands of interviews with women who lived through the fascist period. Their testimonies provide the most direct window into what these policies actually meant in human terms. Teresa notes, a Communist Party organizer and partisan fighter, wrote in her 1974 memoir, "Fascism tried to make us believe that motherhood was our highest calling. But what they really wanted was to make us slaves. They took away our jobs, our education, our choices, and told us we should be grateful. They put us in cages and called them pedestals." Lucia Ottobrini, a factory worker from Milan, said in a 1980 interview, "I had 6 children under fascism. I wanted 3, but there was no choice. No birth control, no way to plan your family, just pressure from everywhere. My body was exhausted. I was exhausted. But if you complained, you were unpatriotic. You were failing Italy. The guilt was crushing." Anna Banti, a writer who struggled to continue her work under fascism, reflected, "They tried to convince us that thinking, creating, working with our minds was unfeminine, that our brains were somehow less important than our wombs. Many women believed it. I fought against believing it every single day. It was exhausting to maintain your sense of self when everything around you said you didn't matter except as a mother. These voices matter because they cut through the propaganda, the statistics, the policy analysis, and show us the human reality. Real women with desires, ambitions, fears, and dreams forced to navigate a system designed to control them. And these women also tell us about resistance, not just the dramatic resistance of partisan fighters, but the everyday resistance of women who found small ways to maintain autonomy, sharing contraception information in whispers, delaying marriage by a few years, pursuing education despite obstacles, supporting other women who defied expectations, creating networks of mutual aid and solidarity, maintaining a sense of self even when the entire apparatus of the state told you that self didn't matter. This everyday resistance didn't overthrow fascism. That required war and armed partisan struggle. But it helped women survive with their identities intact. It created the foundation for the post-war women's movement in Italy. And it proved that even totalitarian regimes cannot fully control the human spirit. In the decades after World War II, Italian historians conducted thousands of interviews with women who lived through the fascist period. Their testimonies provide the most direct window into what these policies actually meant in human terms. Teresa notes, a Communist Party organizer and partisan fighter, wrote in her 1974 memoir, "Fascism tried to make us believe that motherhood was our highest calling. But what they really wanted was to make us slaves. They took away our jobs, our education, our choices, and told us we should be grateful. They put us in cages and called them pedestals." Lucia Ottobrini, a factory worker from Milan, said in a 1980 interview, "I had 6 children under fascism. I wanted 3, but there was no choice. No birth control, no way to plan your family, just pressure from everywhere. My body was exhausted. I was exhausted. But if you complained, you were unpatriotic. You were failing Italy. The guilt was crushing." Anna Banti, a writer who struggled to continue her work under fascism, reflected, "They tried to convince us that thinking, creating, working with our minds was unfeminine, that our brains were somehow less important than our wombs. Many women believed it. I fought against believing it every single day. It was exhausting to maintain your sense of self when everything around you said you didn't matter except as a mother. These voices matter because they cut through the propaganda, the statistics, the policy analysis, and show us the human reality. Real women with desires, ambitions, fears, and dreams forced to navigate a system designed to control them. And these women also tell us about resistance, not just the dramatic resistance of partisan fighters, but the everyday resistance of women who found small ways to maintain autonomy, sharing contraception information in whispers, delaying marriage by a few years, pursuing education despite obstacles, supporting other women who defied expectations, creating networks of mutual aid and solidarity, maintaining a sense of self even when the entire apparatus of the state told you that self didn't matter. This everyday resistance didn't overthrow fascism. That required war and armed partisan struggle. But it helped women survive with their identities intact. It created the foundation for the post-war women's movement in Italy. And it proved that even totalitarian regimes cannot fully control the human spirit.